My cousin Jessica texted, "We all voted. Thanksgiving is at your cabin this year." The problem? Nobody asked me. 2 days later, she showed up with 24 relatives, 3 screaming kids, and a rental van, expecting me to host like some free Airbnb. When she called me screaming, "Open the driveway right now," I just watched from my porch as the tow truck started hooking her car. She thought family meant I had to say yes. She learned the hard way that my cabin wasn't hers. I'm a 36-year-old financial analyst living in Denver, Colorado, and 2 years ago I finally managed to accomplish something I've been dreaming about for almost a decade. After years of saving, skipping vacations, and living in a tiny apartment while working ridiculous hours, I bought a small mountain cabin outside a quiet forest area called Aspen Ridge. It isn't some luxury lodge you see in magazines. It's a modest 2-bedroom cabin tucked between tall pine trees with a small porch, a wood stove, and just enough space to breathe. For me, that place became something close to sacred. Whenever work started suffocating me or family drama got exhausting, I would drive up there for a weekend, hike the nearby trails, read books by the fireplace, and just exist without constant noise. My extended family, on the other hand, thrives on noise. There are dozens of us spread across Colorado and neighboring states, and every holiday becomes this chaotic circus of opinions, arguments, and logistics. At the center of all of it is my cousin Jessica Miller, who unofficially appointed herself the family organizer years ago. Jessica loves planning things for everyone else, whether they ask for it or not. She schedules reunions, birthday gatherings, holiday dinners, and she always talks like she's running a small government rather than a group chat of relatives. I've learned to stay out of most of it. I show up when I can, bring a dish, smile politely, and leave before the evening devolves into debates about politics or who forgot to bring the cranberry sauce. One thing I've always been very clear about, though, is that my cabin is not a family gathering place. I've shown pictures of it before, and a few relatives joked about visiting, but I always brushed it off. The place is small, remote, and more importantly, it's the only place I have that feels entirely mine. That's why what happened on a random Tuesday during my lunch break caught me completely off guard. I was sitting at my desk scrolling through emails and eating a sandwich when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jessica. The message was short, direct, and written in the kind of confident tone she uses when she believes she's already made a decision for everyone. We all voted. Thanksgiving is at your cabin this year. Make sure there's space for about 24 people. For a few seconds, I honestly thought it was a joke. I reread the message twice, waiting for some kind of follow-up text with a laughing emoji or a comment saying she was kidding. Nothing came. My stomach dropped as a realization settled in that she was completely serious. 24 people. My cabin has 2 bedrooms, a small living room, and a kitchen that barely fits 3 adults at once. Even if people brought sleeping bags and crammed onto the floor, the idea of hosting 24 relatives in that space was absurd. I opened the family group chat immediately. There was, buried halfway up the conversation thread, from earlier that morning, Jessica had written something along the lines of how it would be fun to have a cozy forest Thanksgiving this year, instead of the usual crowded suburban house gathering. A few of my aunts reacted with heart emojis. My uncle said it sounded beautiful. Someone else commented that it would be like a holiday movie. Within about 5 messages, a conversation had somehow shifted from a suggestion into a fully formed plan. Not once in that entire thread did anyone ask me if it was okay. Apparently enthusiasm counted as a vote. I stared at my phone for a moment, feeling that strange mix of disbelief and irritation building in my chest. I typed a response to Jessica directly instead of replying to the group chat. Absolutely not. I kept it short because I didn't want to start a massive argument in the middle of my workday. I assumed the message would end the conversation quickly. It felt like the kind of thing that obviously required permission from the person who actually owned the property. Jessica responded almost instantly. Too late. We're already heading there Thursday morning. I remember staring at that message with my sandwich still in my hand, trying to process what she had just said. Thanksgiving was only a couple days away. According to her text, my entire extended family had already convinced themselves that they were going to spend the holiday at my private cabin in the mountains. They weren't asking. They were informing me. And somehow 24 adults believed they were about to treat the quiet place I bought to escape family chaos like it was a free vacation rental. I've never been particularly close with most of my extended relatives, and that distance didn't happen by accident. Growing up, family gatherings were always dominated by the same handful of loud personalities who treated every situation like a competition for control. Conversations weren't really conversations. They were more like verbal wrestling matches where the most confident or aggressive person simply decided how things were going to go. Over the years, I learned that the easiest way to maintain my sanity was to keep my involvement minimal. I would show up, be polite, eat dinner, and leave before the inevitable chaos started. At the center of that chaos has always been my cousin Jessica. Jessica is 41 now, but she has been running family gatherings like a personal project manager since her late 20s. She carries herself with this unwavering confidence that makes it sound like she's speaking on behalf of everyone even when nobody actually asked her to. If she announces something loudly enough and with enough certainty, half the family simply accepts it as the official plan. She is the kind of person who says things like, "We all decided," when in reality what she means is that she decided and nobody bothered to challenge her. Jessica is married to a guy named Kyle, who has spent the last 10 years bouncing between different business opportunities. Every time I see him, he's pitching some new product that's supposedly going to revolutionize health, wealth, or both. One year it was some kind of alkaline water filtration system that he insisted would detox your body. The next year it was powdered mushroom supplements he described as luxury wellness products. Every pitch comes with big promises, vague explanations, and a strong sense that he is one step away from asking you to join a sales team under him. Between the two of them, they have 3 kids, all under the age of 12. And those kids operate like small tornadoes whenever they enter someone else's house. They climb furniture, open cabinets, scatter toys everywhere, and somehow manage to leave every room looking like a miniature disaster zone. Jessica rarely corrects them because she tends to treat other people's homes like extensions of her own living space. What makes the whole situation worse is that Jessica has a long history of slowly pushing boundaries until people stop resisting. Over the years, there have been dozens of smaller incidents that, individually, seemed annoying but manageable. When you stack them together, though, they form a pretty clear pattern. I remember one time when she showed up at our aunt's house for dinner and casually mentioned that she had to run an errand for an hour. Before anyone could respond, she had already unloaded her 3 kids into the living room and walked back out the door, leaving my aunt staring at them like she had just been handed an unexpected daycare shift. Another time, there was a family vacation rental at a lake house where everyone was supposed to split the cost evenly. At the end of the trip, when people started discussing payments, Jessica suddenly acted confused and claimed she thought someone else had covered her portion. Somehow the subject shifted before anyone pressed her too hard about it, and eventually the rest of the family just absorbed the extra cost to avoid an argument. Then there are the guilt trips. Jessica loves using the phrase family loyalty whenever someone pushes back against her plans. If you hesitate about something she wants, she frames it as a personal failure of commitment to the family. She says things like we should all support each other, or this is what family does for one another, and somehow the pressure makes people fold even when they're clearly uncomfortable. For years, I mostly avoided being the direct target of those tactics, simply because I stayed out of her orbit as much as possible. Until now, announcing that 24 people were going to spend Thanksgiving at my quiet mountain cabin, without even asking me first, wasn't just another minor boundary push. It was easily the biggest power move she had ever attempted. My cabin wasn't shared family property or some neutral gathering space. It was something I had spent years saving for, something I used specifically to get away from the exact kind of chaos my extended family tend to bring with them. And Jessica had casually decided it was going to host 24 people. After reading her message again and realizing she genuinely thought this plan was already finalized, I needed to vent to someone who at least understood the situation. So I called my older brother, Mark. Mark has always been the more relaxed one between the two of us. He avoids conflict whenever possible and generally believes that most family issues are easier to ignore than confront. When he answered the phone, I explained everything, starting with Jessica's original text and ending with her claim that everyone was already planning to drive to my cabin Thursday morning. There was a short pause on the line while he processed it. Then he gave a small shrug that I could practically hear through the phone. It's already happening. Just let it go. It's family. That sentence hit me in a way I didn't expect. Just let it go. I had heard that exact phrase countless times during previous family conflicts. Whenever someone crossed a line, whenever Jessica pushed too far, whenever something unfair happened, the easiest solution was always to tell the person being inconvenienced to simply accept it and move on. Normally, I probably would have done exactly that. But this time was different. This wasn't someone borrowing a casserole dish or showing up an hour early for dinner. This was 24 people planning to invade the one place I owned that was meant to be quiet, private, and completely separate from the chaos of the rest of my life. Hearing Mark say, just let it go, didn't calm me down. It flipped a switch somewhere in my head. The disbelief I'd been feeling since Jessica's message started slowly turning into something much more solid: determination. Instead of wasting the next 24 hours arguing with half my relatives in a family group chat, I decided to stop typing and start driving. The following afternoon, I packed a small bag, left my apartment in Denver, and got on the highway heading toward the mountains. The drive to the cabin usually takes a little over 4 hours depending on traffic and weather, and that long stretch of road gave me plenty of time to think about what had happened. At first, my mind kept replaying Jessica's message over and over again. The confidence in her words bothered me more than anything else. She didn't ask if the cabin could host Thanksgiving. She didn't even suggest it. She simply announced that it was happening and expected me to adjust my life around that decision. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that she genuinely believed this was reasonable. The highway slowly gave way to winding mountain roads, and as the city disappeared behind me, the air became colder and cleaner. Pine trees lined the road on both sides, and patches of early snow were still scattered across the higher ground. Every time I drive up there, I feel the tension from work gradually melt away as the scenery shifts from concrete and traffic to quiet forest. By the time I turned onto the long gravel road leading toward Aspen Ridge, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. When I finally reached the cabin and stepped out of my truck, the silence hit me immediately. No distant traffic noise, no neighbors, no buzzing phones or emails demanding attention. Just wind moving gently through the trees and the occasional creaking sound from the wooden porch. The place looked exactly the way I had left it the last time I visited. The small porch railing still had a thin layer of pine needles scattered across it. The same stack of firewood sat neatly beside the wall, and surrounding forest stood perfectly still like nothing in the world had changed. Standing there for a moment, I felt that familiar sense of calm settle over me. Then I remembered that according to my extended family, 24 people were about to descend on this place within 2 days. I walked up onto the porch and leaned against the railing, looking out at the long gravel driveway that curved through the trees toward the road. That driveway stretches almost 200 yards before it reaches the entrance of the property, and it's surrounded by thick forest on both sides. Normally, I love that sense of isolation, but while I stood there, another realization slowly formed in my head. My family didn't really see me as someone who owned this place and had the right to decide how it was used. To them, I was simply the guy with the cabin, the quiet cousin who stayed out of drama, who never caused trouble, who usually avoided confrontation. In their minds, that meant I was easy to push around. If Jessica announced something loudly enough and confidently enough, everyone assumed I would eventually shrug and go along with it. Just like Mark had suggested. Just let it go. That phrase echoed again in my mind while I stood there on the porch, looking at the trees and the silent driveway. For the first time since the text started, I realized something very simple. I didn't actually have to let it go. This place belonged to me. I paid for it. I maintained it. And I was the only person responsible for what happened here. If I allowed 24 people to storm in and turn it into a chaotic holiday circus, that would be my decision. And I had no intention of making that decision. The next morning I woke up early, made a cup of coffee on the small kitchen stove, and drove into the nearest town about 30 minutes away. Aspen Ridge itself is mostly forest and scattered cabins, but the small town nearby has just enough businesses to cover basic needs. My first stop was a locksmith. The shop was small and smelled faintly like metal and machine oil. I explained that I own a cabin outside town and wanted to replace all the exterior locks. The locksmith didn't ask many questions, which I appreciated. Within an hour, he had loaded the necessary tools into his truck and followed me back to the property. We replaced every exterior lock on the cabin: the front door, the back door, and the small side door leading into the utility area. I kept the new keys in my pocket and watched the old locks disappear into his toolbox. Once he finished and drove away, I headed back into town for my second stop, the hardware store. I walked through the aisles slowly until I found exactly what I needed: a heavy length of steel chain and a thick industrial padlock that looked like it could survive a small explosion. I also grabbed a couple of metal hooks and mounting brackets designed for securing gates. The cashier barely glanced at the items as he rang them up. My third step required a phone call. Back at the cabin, I looked up the number for a local towing company that operated in the area and dialed it while standing near the kitchen window. A woman answered with a calm, slightly bored tone of someone used to handling random requests. I explained that I owned private property with a long driveway and that there was a possibility unauthorized vehicles might try to park there soon. I asked how quickly they could respond if I needed a tow. She didn't sound surprised at all. "Give us a call, and we'll be there within an hour." That simple answer felt strangely reassuring. After hanging up, I walked outside carrying the chain, padlock, and the small bag of hardware tools. The entrance to the driveway sits right where the gravel road curves between two thick trees, making it the perfect place to block access. I drilled the brackets into the posts on either side of the driveway, threaded the chain across the opening, and secured it tightly with a padlock. The metal links hung solid and heavy across the path, where any incoming car would normally drive through. Then I attached a sign to the chain. Private property, no trespassing, vehicles will be towed. When I stepped back and looked at it, the message was impossible to misunderstand. The driveway that normally welcomed quiet weekend visits was now very clearly closed. I walked back up to the cabin, sat down on the porch, and looked out at the forest again. And then I waited. Thanksgiving morning in the mountains is usually quiet in a way that feels almost unreal if you're used to city life. When I woke up that day, the forest was still, the air was cold, and the sky was pale gray with thin clouds drifting slowly above the treetops. I made coffee, stepped outside onto the porch, and listened to the sound of wind moving through the tall pine trees surrounding the cabin. There were no voices, no traffic, no distant sounds of people preparing for large holiday gatherings. Just a calm silence that had made me fall in love with this place the first time I visited it years ago. Inside the cabin, the wood stove crackled softly, while I sat near the window, looking down the long gravel driveway that curved between the trees before disappearing near the road. The chain I had installed across the entrance was just barely visible from the porch if you knew where to look. The sign hanging from it caught the light whenever the wind shifted slightly. For most of the morning, nothing happened. Around 11 o'clock, while I was rinsing a mug in the small kitchen sink, I noticed movement through the window. A dark SUV slowly rolled along the gravel road toward the entrance of my property. Even from that distance, I could tell it was moving cautiously, the driver probably scanning for the familiar driveway opening that led to the cabin. The SUV turned toward the entrance. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, another vehicle appeared behind it, a smaller car that pulled up and idled awkwardly a few feet back. Then a third vehicle arrived, this one a large rental van that looked completely out of place on a narrow mountain road. 3 vehicles now sat in a short line in front of the chain blocking my driveway. I stepped out onto the porch and leaned slightly against the railing, watching the scene unfold through the trees. The distance was far enough that I couldn't hear their voices, but I could clearly see the doors opening as people climbed out cars. Even from that far away, I recognized familiar shapes and gestures. Jessica was the first one out of the SUV. She wore a long beige winter coat and immediately walked toward the chain with quick, impatient steps. Kyle climbed out of the driver's seat behind her, looking around the road like he was trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The van door slid open and several kids jumped down onto the gravel, running around the roadside while a couple of my aunts and uncles slowly stepped out behind them. From where I stood, I could see Jessica bend slightly to read the sign hanging from a chain. Her body language shifted almost instantly from confusion to irritation. She turned around and started gesturing toward the driveway like she was explaining something to the rest of the group. Even though I couldn't hear the conversation, I could already imagine exactly what was being said. A moment later, my phone started ringing. Jessica. I let it ring twice before answering. The second I picked up, her voice exploded through the speaker with a sharp tone of someone who believed they were dealing with a minor inconvenience that needed to be fixed immediately. Why is there a chain on your driveway? Her words were fast and irritated, the way people talk when they assume the other person must have made some kind of mistake. I stayed calm. Because you're not coming in. There was a short silence on the line after I said that, the kind of pause that happens when someone's brain struggles to process a response they weren't expecting. When Jessica spoke again, the irritation had shifted into disbelief. What do you mean we're not coming in? In the background of the call, I could hear faint voices and the distant noise of kids moving around near the cars. She lowered her voice slightly, but the sharp edge was still there. We drove 4 hours to get here. We brought food. We brought the kids. Everyone is standing outside your driveway. Just unlock the gate. I leaned slightly against the porch railing and looked down the long stretch of gravel separating us. From this distance, the group looked small against the tall trees and the quiet road. Jessica was pacing back and forth near the chain while holding the phone to her ear. You weren't invited, I said. That sentence landed like a rock. Jessica let out a frustrated breath that sounded half like a laugh and half like pure irritation. Ryan, don't start this. The whole family is here. I could hear the tone she was trying to use, the familiar combination of authority and forced patience she used whenever she believed someone else was being unreasonable. You knew we were coming. We talked about this. No, I said calmly. You talked about it. I said no. For a moment the line went quiet again. I could picture the exact expression she probably had on her face, that tight smile she uses when she's about to shift into emotional manipulation mode. Her voice softened slightly, but the words carried a heavy layer of guilt she loved using. Are you really turning away your whole family on Thanksgiving? The way she said it made it sound like I was committing some kind of moral betrayal instead of enforcing a very basic boundary. I looked out at the trees surrounding the property, then back toward the road where my relatives stood clustered near their cars. You turned yourselves away, I said. Another pause followed, this one longer than the others. Jessica didn't respond immediately, and for the first time since this entire situation started, I could imagine that the reality of the moment was finally sinking in for her. The chain wasn't a misunderstanding. The sign wasn't temporary. They had driven all the way to my cabin, expecting a free holiday gathering, and they were standing outside a locked entrance. I didn't give her time to start another argument. I ended the call. Then I slipped my phone back into my pocket and stayed on the porch, quietly watching the scene unfold at the end of the driveway. After I ended the call, I stayed exactly where I was on the porch, leaning lightly against a wooden railing, while looking down the long gravel stretch that separated the cabin from the road. The distance gave the entire scene a strange sense of detachment, almost like watching something unfold on a screen, rather than being directly involved in it. My relatives were still gathered near their cars, their movements sharp and restless, as the situation clearly failed to go the way they had expected. Jessica was pacing back and forth near the chain, her arms moving in exaggerated gestures as she talked to the others. Even from far away, I could recognize the rhythm of her frustration. Kyle stood a few feet away with his hands on his hips, occasionally glancing down the driveway toward the cabin like he was hoping I might suddenly appear and reverse the situation. A couple of my aunts were standing near the van, looking confused and irritated at the same time, while the kids ran around the roadside with the restless energy that comes from being trapped in a long car ride only to arrive somewhere they couldn't actually go. For several minutes, nothing changed. They looked at the chain, they talked among themselves, and a few of them walked up to the entrance of the driveway, as if examining whether the barrier was real or just symbolic. Then something else appeared on the road. A large tow truck slowly rounded the bend behind their parked vehicles, its engine rumbling steadily as it approached. The bright metal frame and hydraulic arm on the back caught the pale morning light, making it stand out sharply against a quiet forest road. I watched as the truck rolled closer and eventually stopped a short distance behind the line of family cars. The driver stepped out of the cab and took a quick look at the situation in front of him. He was a broad-shouldered guy wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap, the kind of person who had probably dealt with all kinds of roadside disputes before. He walked forward with calm, unhurried steps until he reached a cluster of confused relatives standing near the driveway entrance. From where I stood, I couldn't hear the exact words being exchanged, but I could see the conversation begin almost immediately. Jessica moved toward him first. Her arms were already raised in that familiar animated way she uses when she believes she's explaining something obvious to someone who simply hasn't understood yet. Kyle stepped forward beside her, nodding occasionally while pointing toward the cabin farther up the driveway. The driver listened without much visible reaction. Then he glanced at the chain across the entrance and the sign hanging from it. Private property, no trespassing, vehicles will be towed. He looked back at the vehicles parked along the road. Jessica continued talking, her gestures becoming sharper and more dramatic. One of my uncles joined the conversation, stepping forward and pointing toward a group of people like he was emphasizing that they all belonged there. Even from a distance, I could tell they were trying to explain that they were family, that this was some kind of misunderstanding, that the whole situation was unnecessary. The driver didn't appear interested in debating any of it. After a brief moment, he turned, walked back toward his truck, and began preparing the towing equipment. That was the moment when the tone of the entire scene shifted. Jessica immediately started moving faster, her posture rigid with anger as she followed him toward the truck. Kyle walked beside her, speaking rapidly while gesturing toward the vehicles. My brother Mark stepped forward as well, raising his hands in a calmer motion like he was attempting to negotiate something. But the driver kept working. He lowered the towing arm, positioned the truck carefully behind the first SUV, and began attaching the equipment with steady mechanical precision. Jessica's voice carried faintly through the cold air now, sharp and loud even at that distance. She was clearly yelling. Her body language had changed from frustration to outright outrage, her arms cutting through the air as she spoke. Mark stood beside her trying to talk to the driver with a calmer posture, occasionally turning back toward the others like he was attempting to manage the situation. Near the van, a couple of the kids had started crying. The tension among the adults had spread quickly through the group, and the children were reacting the way kids always do when they sense that something has gone very wrong. None of it slowed the tow truck driver down. Within a few minutes, the first SUV was fully secured. The hydraulic system lifted the front wheels off the ground, and the vehicle tilted slightly as the truck prepared to pull away. While all of that unfolded down the driveway, my phone began vibrating repeatedly in my pocket. I took it out and glanced at the screen. Messages were flooding in, one after another. You're unbelievable. The kids are upset. You've embarrassed the whole family. Your parents will hear about this. The notifications kept stacking up while the situation on the road continued to unravel. Calls started appearing too, one after another, the screen lighting up repeatedly with names I recognized from the group standing outside my property. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I put the phone back into my pocket and kept watching quietly from the porch. The tow truck slowly pulled the first vehicle away from the roadside and began preparing for the next one. Jessica was still arguing loudly, her voice rising in sharp bursts that occasionally echoed faintly through the trees. Mark stood nearby with a defeated posture now, his earlier attempt at negotiation clearly failing. One by one, the vehicles were hooked and removed from the roadside. The entire process took less than an hour. Eventually, the truck disappeared down the mountain road with the last vehicle, leaving behind nothing but the empty gravel stretch where my relatives had been standing earlier. By the time the forest settled back into silence again, the road was completely clear. The chain still hung across the entrance of my driveway, the sign swaying slightly in the cold breeze. I stood there on the porch for a while longer, listening to the quiet return to the mountains. For the first time in years, I had protected something that actually mattered to me. The silence that returned to Mountain Road that afternoon didn't last very long once I checked my phone again. For a while, I had left it in my pocket while sitting on the porch, simply enjoying the calm that settled over the forest after the last tow truck disappeared around the bend. The air was cold and clear, and the only sound left was the wind brushing to pine branches above the cabin. It felt peaceful in a way that Thanksgiving rarely does. Eventually, I took the phone out again. The screen lit up with an avalanche of notifications, dozens of missed calls, messages stacked on top of each other in the family group chat, private texts from cousins, aunts, and even relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, suddenly deciding they needed to tell me exactly how wrong I was. The tone was almost identical across all of them. You went too far. The kids were crying. You embarrassed everyone. I didn't respond to any of it that day. I put the phone back down on the small kitchen table and spent the rest of the evening the way I had originally planned to spend Thanksgiving before this entire situation exploded. I cooked a simple dinner, lit the wood stove, and sat by the window watching the last light disappear behind the trees. But the backlash didn't stop once the holiday ended. Over the next week, the story of what happened spread to the extended family, like a carefully crafted narrative where I was cast as the obvious villain. The version being told didn't include the part where I had said no from the beginning, or the part where Jessica had tried to force the plan anyway. Instead, the story was framed in the most dramatic way possible. Ryan locked his entire family out on Thanksgiving. That was a headline everyone seemed to settle on. A couple of days later, I saw the first social media post. One of my cousins had uploaded pictures from what looked like a hastily organized dinner at someone else's house. Folding tables had been pushed together. Paper plates covered with leftover dishes sat scattered across the surface, and several relatives were posing in front of the camera with exaggerated smiles. The caption read something about how family finds a way even when certain people forget basic human decency. There were comments underneath from other relatives agreeing with the sentiment. Some of them didn't mention my name directly, but the meaning was obvious enough that it didn't need clarification. My parents called not long after that. The conversation started calmly, but the disappointment in their voices was impossible to miss. They had already heard the family's version of events, and by the time they spoke to me, it was clear that most of the story had already been shaped by everyone else's perspective. They talked about how shocked everyone had been. They mentioned the kids being upset, and the long drive people had made expecting a holiday gathering. My mother used the word humiliating at one point while describing how it must have felt for family to stand outside the property like that. I explained exactly what had happened and reminded them that I had refused the idea days earlier. The conversation didn't really resolve anything. They believed I had reacted too harshly. I believed the entire situation had been forced on me in the first place. Neither side moved very far from those positions. Other relatives followed with their own messages during the days that came after. Some texts were openly angry, accusing me of selfishness and cruelty. Others were more subtle, using the passive-aggressive tone that families often adopt when they want to express disapproval, while pretending to stay polite. A few of them framed their criticism as concern, saying things like they hoped I would eventually realize how much damage I had done to family relationships. Even my brother Mark reached out again. His message was shorter than most of the others, but the conclusion was the same. He said he understood why I was frustrated, but still believed I had overreacted. Reading that sentence felt strangely familiar. Overreacted. That word carried the same message I had heard so many times over the years whenever someone in the family crossed a line. The problem was never the behavior itself. The problem was the person who finally refused to tolerate it. After a few days of watching the constant stream of criticism roll in, I stopped replying entirely. I muted the family group chat. I ignored the incoming calls. I let the messages sit unanswered. Instead of arguing with people who had already decided I was wrong, I stayed at the cabin for most of the winter. The mountains become even quieter once the holidays pass, and the snow settles deeper into the forest. The long gravel road leading to the property often sits completely untouched for days at a time. Mornings start with frost on the porch railing, and the distant sound of wind moving through snow-covered branches. During those weeks, I spent a lot of time thinking about everything that had led to that Thanksgiving morning. The more I replayed the past years in my mind, the clearer a pattern became. It wasn't just about the cabin or that single holiday. It was about how many small boundaries I had allowed to be ignored simply because pushing back felt uncomfortable. Every time Jessica had dropped her kids somewhere without warning, every time she had shifted costs onto someone else during family trips, every time someone told me to just let things go for the sake of keeping the peace. I had accepted those moments quietly because avoiding conflict seemed easier. That winter, I started writing things down. At first, it was just casual journaling in a notebook I kept on the small wooden table near the fireplace. I wrote about past family gatherings, about conversations that had bothered me at the time, but that I had brushed aside, about the strange pressure that always existed during holidays where expectations seemed to override basic respect. Eventually, I decided to start therapy as well. Talking to someone outside the family helped me see the situation more clearly than I ever had before. The conversations weren't about blaming anyone or turning every memory into some kind of dramatic revelation. They were simply about understanding how often I had allowed other people's expectations to shape my decisions. Over time, the anger surrounding that Thanksgiving slowly faded. What replaced it was something much quieter and more stable. Clarity. The cabin remained the place where I spent most of my weekends. The forest still offered the same calm always had, but now the silence felt less like an escape and more like a reset point. I started reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen much during the years when work and family obligations had filled most of my time. Some of them visited the cabin occasionally, small groups who respected the quiet and treated the place the way I always intended it to be treated. Gradually, my life began shifting in a direction that felt healthier than the old pattern of constant family expectations. Instead of measuring my time around obligations I felt pressured to fulfill, I started building a circle of friendships that existed because people genuinely enjoyed spending time together. The mountain stayed quiet. The cabin stayed mine. And for the first time in a long time, the boundaries I had drawn actually remained in place. Several months passed after Thanksgiving, and by the time spring began creeping back into the mountains, the entire situation with my extended family had settled into an uncomfortable kind of distance. The angry messages had eventually slowed down and then mostly stopped. A few relatives still occasionally posted passive comments online about loyalty and family values, but I had stopped paying attention to that part of the internet entirely. Life became quieter in ways that felt almost unfamiliar at first. Most of my time outside of work was spent at the cabin. The snow gradually melted from the forest floor, the air grew warmer, and the long gravel road leading to the property became easier to drive again after months of icy patches and frozen ruts. I settled into a routine that felt steady and predictable. Work during the week in Denver, long quiet weekends surrounded by trees, and fresh air whenever I needed distance from the city. Then one afternoon, something arrived in my mailbox that immediately pulled my attention away from everything else. It was a formal letter from a law office. At first, I assumed it was some kind of administrative notice or mistake. But when I opened the envelope and read the contents more carefully, I realized it was an official request of me to attend a private meeting regarding the state of my great-uncle Victor Carter. Victor was one of the more mysterious relatives in the family tree. He was my grandfather's younger brother, a man who had always lived his life a little differently from the rest of the family. While most of my relatives stayed clustered around the same few towns in Colorado, Victor spent decades moving around the country. At various points, he lived in Oregon, Washington, and eventually California. Family gatherings were never really his thing, and when he did occasionally show up, he tended to sit quietly at the edge of conversations rather than inserting himself into the loud debates that usually dominated those events. Because of that distance, many relatives described him as eccentric. I always thought he was just someone who preferred calm over chaos. When I was younger, he would sometimes appear holidays unexpectedly, stay for a short time, and then leave before the noise of the gathering fully took over the house. As I got older and started working, I visited him a handful of times whenever I happened to travel through Northern California. Those visits were always simple. We would sit outside, drink coffee, talk about books or hiking trails, and enjoy the quiet views of the ocean near his property. He never talked much about money or possessions. The letter explained that Victor had recently passed away and that a reading of his will was scheduled at the attorney's office handling the estate. My presence had been specifically requested. A few days later, I drove to the address listed in the letter, a small legal office located in a quiet building near downtown. The waiting area was calm and professional, with shelves full of legal books and framed certificates hanging neatly on the walls. The attorney who greeted me introduced himself and led me into a conference room, where several documents were already arranged neatly across the table. The atmosphere felt formal, but not overly dramatic, more like a straightforward legal meeting than the tense family scenes people imagine when they think about reading a will. Once we sat down, he began explaining the basic structure of Victor's estate. Victor had owned property in Northern California for many years, along with several financial accounts that had been placed into a trust. According to the attorney, Victor had left clear instructions about how those assets should be distributed. Then the lawyer paused briefly and looked down at the document in front of him. He explained that a specific portion of the estate had been designated entirely to me. At first, I thought I had misunderstood him. He clarified the details slowly and carefully. Victor had left me full ownership of his coastal property, located in Northern California. The house itself sat on 12 acres of land overlooking the ocean, along a rocky stretch of cliffs that I remembered visiting once years earlier. Along with the property, he had also placed a trust fund in my name containing approximately $2.6 million. The number sounded unreal the first time I heard it. The attorney continued explaining that the inheritance came with no conditions attached. The property title would transfer directly to my name, and the trust had already been legally established to ensure the funds remained under my control. For a few moments, I simply sat there processing the information. Victor had never given any indication that something like this might happen. Our visits had always felt casual and relaxed, never transactional or strategic in any way. Then the attorney handed me a smaller envelope that had been included with the estate documents. Inside was a short handwritten note. The handwriting was unmistakably Victor's. The message itself was simple. He wrote that throughout the years many relatives had visited him, but those visits usually arrived with requests attached to them. People wanted business advice, financial help, access to the property for vacations, or introductions to contact he had made during his career. According to the note, I had been the only relative who ever showed up without asking for something. He mentioned the quiet visits where we had simply talked, shared coffee, and walked along the cliffs without any expectation beyond spending time together. Because of that, he believed I understood the value of having a place where peace mattered more than noise or obligation. When I finished reading the note, the room felt strangely quiet. For a long time, I had believed that most of my extended family saw me only as a quiet cousin who rarely challenged anyone and who happened to own a cabin they could potentially use whenever it suited them. But sitting there with Victor's letter in my hands, I realized something that shifted my perspective in a completely different direction. Someone in the family had actually noticed the way I lived. Someone had seen how often I stayed out of the constant cycle of demands and expectations that surrounded so many of our gatherings. And more importantly, someone had understood exactly why places like my cabin meant so much to me. The inheritance wasn't just money or land. It was recognition that the way I had chosen to live quietly and independently hadn't gone completely unnoticed after all. The months following the inheritance moved slowly but steadily, and by the time spring arrived again, I had spent enough time traveling back and forth between Colorado and Northern California to fully understand what Victor had left behind. The property sat on a stretch of rugged coastline where the cliffs dropped sharply into the Pacific Ocean, and the view alone was enough to make the entire place feel almost unreal. The house itself was built decades earlier but had been carefully maintained, sitting slightly back from the edge of the cliffs with wide windows that faced the water. The 12 acres surrounding it were mostly untouched land covered with coastal grass, scattered cypress trees, and narrow walking paths that led toward the bluff overlooking the ocean. The first few times I visited after the inheritance became official, I walked the property quietly, trying to absorb the scale of what had changed in my life. The financial trust alone would have allowed me to live comfortably for years if I chose to step away from work entirely. But the land itself felt far more meaningful than the money. It carried the same sense of calm I had always valued in my mountain cabin. Only this time the background was endless ocean instead of forest. Very quickly, I decided that the property needed to be protected properly. The cabin experience had taught me an important lesson about boundaries and expectations, and I had no intention of repeating the same mistakes with a place that carried even more value. Over the next several weeks, I arranged for a series of practical upgrades that made the property far more secure and controlled than it had ever been before. A professional contractor installed a heavy steel gate at the entrance of the long private road leading toward the house. The gate was connected to an access system that only opened through a secure keypad and remote authorization. Security cameras were mounted along the entrance road and around the house itself, feeding live footage to a monitoring service that could alert me immediately if anyone attempted to enter the property without permission. At the same time, I contacted a luxury property management agency that specialized in renting high-end homes to private clients who valued discretion and security. After several meetings and inspections, the agency agreed to manage short-term leases for the house with carefully screened tenants. The arrangement meant that when I wasn't using the property myself, the house would occasionally host high-profile guests who expected privacy and were willing to pay for it. Everything about the arrangement was structured, professional, and very clearly defined. By the time all of those systems were in place, the property had become exactly what Victor seemed to have imagined when he left it to me, a quiet retreat that remained protected from the kind of casual intrusion that had always surrounded family gatherings. Then one morning in early spring, something happened that felt almost predictable. I had arrived at the house the night before and spent the evening walking along the cliffs while the sun disappeared into the ocean. The next morning, I was sitting near the large front window with a cup of coffee when I noticed movement on the security monitor connected to the entrance gate. 2 cars had pulled up outside the property. Even before the camera zoomed in closer, I recognized them. The first vehicle belonged to Jessica. The second was Mark's car. I watched quietly as the cameras captured them stepping out onto the gravel road outside the gate. Jessica looked exactly the way she always did when she believed she was arriving somewhere she fully intended to enter. Her posture carried the same confident energy I had seen countless times at family gatherings, the kind that suggested she already assumed things would go her way. Kyle stood beside her, while Mark leaned against his car, looking slightly less certain about the situation, but still present. I walked outside and followed the path down toward the gate. The ocean wind moved steadily across the open land, while I approached them from the inside of the property. By the time I reached the entrance, Jessica had already stepped closer to the gate, her hands resting on the metal bars, as if she expected someone to open it automatically. When she saw me walking toward them, her expression shifted into a wide smile. "Relax," she said casually, like this was the most natural thing in the world. "We just came for a weekend getaway." The sentence was delivered with the same easy confidence she had used months earlier when she announced that Thanksgiving would happen at my cabin. In her mind, the decision had already been made. I stopped a few feet inside the gate. "You're not staying here," I said calmly. "You're not even coming in." For a moment, Jessica simply stared at me like she expected the sentence to transform into a joke. When it didn't, the smile slowly disappeared from her face. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice tightening slightly. "This place is huge. We figured it would be perfect for family trips." I explained the situation in a steady tone. The property was privately leased through a management agency. The security system monitored the entire area. Tenants expected privacy, and access to the property was strictly controlled. In other words, this wasn't a place where relatives could casually show up expecting a vacation. Jessica's frustration built almost immediately. Her voice grew louder as she started listing reasons why the situation didn't make sense to her. She talked about families sharing things, about how properties like this should bring people together rather than push them apart. Kyle nodded beside her while Mark remained mostly quiet, shifting his weight slightly as the conversation grew more tense. Eventually, Jessica said something that sounded painfully familiar. Families should share everything. For a moment, I simply looked at her through the metal bars of the gate. Then I said the words that had been building quietly inside my mind for years. "You lost access to my life the moment you decided my boundaries were optional." The sentence landed heavily in the space between us. Jessica's expression hardened into pure anger, the kind that appears when someone realizes that their usual strategies are no longer working. She started arguing again, insisting that I was overreacting, that I was isolating myself, that none of this needed to be so dramatic. But the gate stayed closed. After several Minutes the conversation ran out of energy. Mark eventually walked back toward his car. Kyle followed a moment later. Jessica lingered for a few seconds longer, staring through the gate like she was still hoping something might change. Then she turned and walked away as well. The two cars drove down the road and disappeared around the bend. That evening, sitting at the large wooden table inside the house, I opened my laptop and wrote one final message to the family group chat. I kept the message simple and direct. I'm stepping away from family gatherings and expectations. My properties are private and will not be used for family events. If I don't respond to messages, that's intentional. It's called a boundary. After sending the email, I closed the laptop and set it aside. Outside the windows, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, turning the ocean into a long stretch of orange light. The house was completely silent, except for the distant sound of waves hitting the rocks below the cliffs. For the first time in my life, the absence of my family's voices didn't feel like rejection. It felt like freedom.